he was probably drinking heavily at most stages in his adult life.
He liked being around young women.
The Nazi mass rallies are essentially theatrical stagings.
Tolstoy is the archetypal repentant nobleman.
It's basically absorbed into Macbeth.
His father, his uncles, his grandfathers, they all die. No role models.
Welcome to the Canon Club with Paul Morland and Ed West, exploring the Western canon in art, music and literature, one life at a time. This week,
Vincent Van Gogh was well into his mid-20s before he really decided that this was his course in life. Gauguin seems to have been quite a respectable cook. Toulouse-Lautrec, by the way, was apparently an outstanding cook, so a combination of cookery and art was quite possible in the late 19th century. He obviously was desperately lonely, would have liked some sort of relationship. The great irony of his life is that he has astonishing, amazing charm at a distance. His work and his letters exercise a tremendous attraction.
Van Gogh.
Vincent van Gogh was born in 1853 in the Netherlands, the son of a Protestant clergyman and into a family with close ties to the art world. Initially, he struggled to find direction, working in various roles in his homeland, in England and France, and at one time setting up as a preacher among Belgian coal miners. But increasingly, he dedicated himself to painting, mixing in Paris with leading impressionists and post-impressionists, and eventually moving to Arles in the south of France, where he achieved a distinct and striking style. Financially reliant on his generous brother Theo, his mental health deteriorated, with him first cutting off his ear and eventually killing himself in 1890, aged just 37. Repute came shortly after his death, and today he is one of the world's most popular artists, his works of art attracting some of the highest prices in the art world. Martin Gayford is a distinguished art critic who has written about Van Gogh's period in Arles, living with Gauguin. He joins us today to talk about the man considered one of the greatest artists of all time. Martin, thanks so much for coming. I read your wonderful book. It really was, and we will focus a lot later on that period, which is obviously the kind of key moment. I would like to start with his background, a sort of short sort of summary of, because the kind of relationship with religion is very interesting. And he was born in Groot-Zundert, I understand, which is in Brabant, which was South Brabant, is that right? Which is a Catholic area, but he's from a Calvinist family.
Well, he was in Scottish terms, you'd call a son of the manse. He was brought up in a rectory. His father, Theodorus, was a clergyman of the Dutch Reformed Church. And the reason why they were in Brabant, which is right down in the south of the Netherlands near the Belgian border, is that Theodorus wasn't very talented as a clergyman. He wasn't very good at preaching, and he was put in a parish where there weren't very many Protestants. So it wasn't a very important place from the point of view of the Dutch Reformed Church. And from the landscape point of view, which might have been important to Vincent and his mother, who had artistic interests, it was a rather beautiful sylvan place in which he grew up. His relationship with religion was complicated and evolved through time, and started off perhaps with a father-son struggle. He was a rebellious child, difficult child. He was the eldest. There was a previous Vincent van Gogh, a baby which had died the year before, and in the way that parents did in the 19th century, they christened the next child with the same name. And he was, the indications are he was rebellious, difficult, a bit strange, perhaps, right from the start.
All right, I was just going to ask, but when I read about his relationship with his brother when I was younger, I always assumed that his brother Theo, who's the sensible one, would have been the eldest, because such was a relationship. Vincent was the sort of rebellious.
Yes, actually, Theo was 4 years younger, I think, but he was a lot steadier and actually a lot better at doing a normal job. He was quite a successful art dealer.
Can you give us a bit of background on the historical context, the economic world the political world, the social world of the Netherlands at the time he was born, at least insofar as it impacted his art?
One of the things to understand about Vincent van Gogh and the Van Goghs generally was that they were very comfortably middle class. This is something which, it's a point which is made by other artists. Both Tracy Emin and David Hockney have made this point quite firmly. There is a sort of legend which has a sort of a certain amount of truth to it that Vincent was poverty-stricken and lived a life of miserable penury. But actually the family he came from was highly successful. His father being perhaps the least successful of the brothers, but he came from a successful professional family. One of his uncles was a rear admiral. Another uncle whom he was named after was one of the most successful art dealers in Western Europe. So the Van Goghs generally were very well plugged into the cultural and economic status quo of the mid-19th century. Vincent was born more or less exactly halfway through the 19th century, and had connections all over Europe. And indeed, he lived in a surprisingly large number of different places for somebody who died when he was 37.
His back, I mean, he had two uncles who were art dealers, and his grandfather was an art dealer. And he started, I mean, he's quite common amongst great artists of any field in that he had a background that was quite immersed in I mean, successful composers often have fathers who composers, and they sort of grow up in the world. But he started art relatively late. I mean,
the very late starter by artist terms. I mean, Italian Renaissance artists often started when they were 12. That was when Michelangelo left school and was apprenticed. David Hockney points out that he was a bit late in starting when he was 16. Vincent van Gogh was well into his mid-20s before he really decided that this was his course in life, which is distinctly on the late side. And although he came from a family which was very well established in art commerce, there is no indication that anyone, including Vincent, thought of him following the course of actually being an artist until quite late on.
Before we go on to talk about him becoming an artist, can you run us through the sorts of experiences he had before that point? Because he travelled quite widely. He lived in a number of countries, including the UK, and maybe he had experiences which turned out to be important in his artistic development.
Well, he'd been, but at that stage when he was probably 1879, 1880, when he was 26, 27, when he made this decision. And at that stage, he'd been a complete failure in a large number of different callings in life. And I imagine his family assumed he'd just carry on being a failure. And at that point, there was a bit of a family discussion about what on earth Vincent could do, and there were various suggestions. One of his sisters suggests he might become a baker, for example, but one of the most famous painters who ever lived, that just wasn't a possibility that it remotely occurred to anyone. He started off, I mean, a rather obvious thing for the Van Gogh boys to do was for their rich uncle, Sant, or Vincent, who was a very successful art dealer, to arrange for them to be given a job in his firm. And that happened to Vincent first. At that stage, his uncle had bought a small 30% share in a very large art dealership, which was based in Paris, but with branches all over Europe. And he started off at 19 in The Hague, and things almost immediately went wrong. By the end of the year he started, there had been a decision that he just couldn't carry on in The Hague for one reason or another, some kind of bad behaviour which is never quite spelled out. So he was sent instead to London, where he lived in various parts of South London, including Brixton. And after a while, the people in London said, this just isn't working, he'll have to go. And after a short break, he returned. He did a short stint carrying on as a failed art dealer, and then he got a job as an unpaid assistant master in a prep school in Ramsgate, which is my favourite choice of the most improbable job for a great artist to assume. And then had another job in a school in Isleworth and did a bit of unpaid volunteer preaching at that stage. Went back to the Netherlands, got a job in a bookshop. That wasn't a great success. He then decided he'd become a clergyman, tried to get the necessary academic qualifications to go to a theological school in Amsterdam. That didn't work. And then after that, perhaps in a state of desperation, he became a volunteer preacher in the Belgian coal fields, again, an unsalaried post. And actually, he was discharged from this unsalaried post after a while because it was going so badly. And it was at that point when he really had failed at everything he'd tried that he thought he'd become an artist.
You describe how here and later when he's in the south of France, the sort of the local people would not take to him, and they thought he was a kind of very strange guy, and they sort of throw things at him. And he seems to repeatedly come across. Firstly, he's very argumentative. He argues in all his class, and he sort of gives people, I suppose you say, the creeps. Now he was just. Yeah, kind of lacking in social charms or whatever.
I think completely lacking in charm in person, whereas the great irony of his life is that he has astonishing, amazing charm at a distance. His work and his letters exercise tremendous attraction throughout, I mean, globally, irrespective of culture.
And he was still religious at this point. I mean, he was very religious when he was in Isleworth, which I find so improbable.
Yes, well, that's pretty improbable, as is the fact that he once walked to Welwyn Garden City. I find that very surprising. Very surprising.
They don't really take enough of much of their association. These places. I mean, I would open up a Van Gogh pub or
a blue plaque. One of the houses in South London, I think you can visit. There's a certain amount of attention given to that.
Yeah, but he was still very, because this is, you talk about this is the Andover Beach period when he later completely loses faith, or he replaces faith with something else. But in his early stages, he was still a great believer.
Yes, I think he fairly rapidly lost his faith after he gave up this preaching appointment. Scarcely even an appointment, but this preaching in the Belgian coalfields. It must have been after that. He writes later that he'd lost his faith by the mid-late 1880s. I would have thought he lost it about then.
Do you want to tell us a bit about his romantic life before we get on to the point at which he becomes an artist?
Well, crucially, I was just saying that poor old Vincent had no charm for actual living human beings who encountered him. He was tolerated in Bohemian French artistic circles up to a point, understood a bit more, but very few people who he met were drawn to him. And crucially, and very sadly for him, that particularly applied to women. He obviously was desperately lonely, would have liked some sort of relationship, but had great difficulty in persuading women that he wasn't an alarming or as you said, creepy presence. He possibly frightened people. There's evidence that he frightened people who he was trying to persuade to sit for him. He probably had a very jerky, I don't know what's that. He probably had a rather jerky manner. He was irascible. He was terribly talkative. He wasn't very good looking. There were lots of reasons why people wouldn't have been attracted to him, and they definitely weren't.
I find this a very little interesting touch, how the 13-year-old Jean Calmez, I'm pronouncing it right, and she meets, as a 13-year-old, this very uncharming Dutch painter who sort of she finds kind of horrific. And she's an interesting, she dies in 1997, age, I think, 122. She died the same month as Princess Diana, I think.
Well, that's true, although there's a degree of controversy about her.
Did she slightly lie about her age?
There is a thesis which was presented by some Russian specialists in very old people who I think wanted to back more Slavic candidates for the oldest person who's ever lived, who claimed that in fact there'd been some sort of complicated financial swindle whereby her daughter had replaced her. And
I think there was some agreement with a neighbour to sell the house, or you pay the rent until I die, and then she lives another 50 years or something.
That's supposed to be true. But anyway, it's probably the case that she really was remarkably old, and she may well have had a memory of Van Gogh. She certainly told my friend Martin Bailey, who met her in the early 1990s, that was the case, and that he was disagreeable and smelt strongly, which again doesn't sound necessarily wrong. Yeah, he had terrible dental problems.
It didn't help that he lost so many teeth, didn't he? He'd lost about 10 teeth by this stage.
It's probably time for us to start to move on to talk about him as an artist. Now, the way we were talking earlier sort of suggests there was a moment when he decided to take up this calling. But surely he was sketching and scribbling before that moment. So what was he doing, and was there such a moment?
Well, there are early drawings which certainly show promise, talent from the 1870s, but he didn't apply himself or think of himself as an artist or a potential artist until probably 1880, when he was turning 27. And one of the many remarkable and unusual things about Vincent van Gogh is that he was largely untrained, not completely so, but that's one of the things which makes him rather characteristic modern artist, I think. Van Gogh is the first of a series of major painters who don't have any sort of substantial art school training. Francis Bacon's another example. He spent 3 weeks being shown how to paint by a relation called Anton Mauve, who was quite a notable 19th century Dutch painter, but they seem to have fallen out after that, and they had quarrelled by a few months later. And he hung around various studios in Paris where there was training for young artists, but he usually seems to have fallen out with whoever was teaching him. And I think you could claim that he's largely a self-created artist, which is astounding, really. Almost everything he did is good. Lucian Freud once said to me that he'd never seen a bad Van Gogh, and there might be a few, but they're very rare.
And who were his influences in his early days?
Until he apparently rather spontaneously jumped on a train and went to join brother Theo, who was living in Paris, which was in the spring of 1886. He was a disciple of the mid-19th century school, which is usually described as realism. There are French and Dutch varieties of that. This fellow Mauve, I mentioned before, was quite an important member of the Hague School, who were quite close in style to French realists who tended to hang out in the forest of Fontainebleau and the countryside a bit south of Paris. And what they did was sober depictions of country life, landscape, in a way which was unidealized, not connected with the classicism of Claude or earlier traditions, but on the other hand was not chromatically or in terms of color ebullient in the way that the Impressionists were. It's the alternative name for the Hague School is the Grey School, and Van Gogh's early work is brown, grey, low-toned, and given to depicting rather gloomy northern landscapes and peasant life.
By this stage, like a lot of things are already starting to go wrong. I mean, he'd had this relationship with his prostitutes. Cien, how it's pronounced. And there was also he was also drinking a lot already by this stage, on and off. And he out with his brother said he couldn't live with him because he was just too difficult.
Everyone found him impossible, and things have probably always been, his behaviour had probably always been a bit off, disconcerted people. It may well be that the reason why he was booted out of the art dealership in The Hague was that he'd started hanging around brothels in that city and drinking heavily. He says quite late in life in a letter, after the ear amputation episode and major crisis in Arles, he writes, somehow my mental state's always been a bit, the words translated as vague, a bit off, a bit unusual.
Going back to the artistic style, when I saw The Potato Eaters, for example, it made me think there's something very Dutch about him. In many ways, it reminds me of the extraordinary tradition of 17th century Dutch art. Would you agree with that? At that stage, at least.
You're absolutely right. There was about maybe a quarter of a century ago, the Van Gogh Museum had an exhibition called Vincent's Choice, which was devoted to works of art which he explicitly, an artist that he explicitly said he admired. And a lot of them are of the type I was describing before, mid-19th century realists, but he was hugely admiring of Rembrandt, Frans Hals, Rubens, and I think in quite a few ways they were more important influences on him than contemporaries. I think the most striking thing, apart from the colour, about Van Gogh's mature style is the brushwork, and that comes, if one could name one single source, that would be Rembrandt. And he said I think it was probably 1885, to a friend he visited the Rijksmuseum with, that he sat down in front of Rembrandt's Jewish Bride, great late Rembrandt painting, and his friend went and wandered around the museum and came back, and Van Gogh was still sitting in front of the Jewish Bride, and he said apparently, I could sit in front of this painting for a week with a loaf of bread and a jug of water to sustain me. And that impasto, that expressive use of paint, I think Rembrandt's perhaps the main source for that.
Shall we move on to talk about his time in Paris? Because it seems early on in his artistic career, that was a very important and formative time before he moved south. What was he painting? Who was he meeting? And what was going on in his life?
Early in 1886, he had been living for a short while in Antwerp. He got on a train spontaneously, impulsively, it seems, and turned up in Paris and went to see his brother, who was living there as a fairly successful junior art dealer, and started living with Theo and spent the best part of 2 years living in Paris. It's, from a documentary point of view, it's the period in his life we know least about, for the simple but tantalizing reason that most of his letters were to Theo, and when he was sharing a flat with Theo and seeing him every day, he obviously didn't need to write long gossipy letters about what he was doing. So the total correspondence for 1886 and 87 is very small. But in terms of his work, it was a watershed point. As I say, he'd been a gloomy Dutch realist of distinct talent up until that point. I mean, pretty remarkable achievement considering that he's only been painting for about 5 years at that point. David Hockney once observed that if he hadn't gone to Paris, we might have heard of Van Gogh. We'd hear about him as a minor Dutch master of the 19th century. All the work which, or almost all the work for which is renowned, came after he went to Paris, and the essential thing that happened to him in Paris is that he discovered particularly the Impressionists and what artists we refer to as the post-impressionists. He'd read about them before he went to Paris. He'd never seen an Impressionist painting. They weren't widely exhibited, apparently not anywhere in places he'd been at that point. Impressionism was still quite new. first impressionist exhibition was in the 1870s. He was there a bit over a decade later. And what Van Gogh worked towards, I think you could simplify as an expressive brushwork derived, as I was saying before, from 17th century masters, plus impressionist color. That's the basic formula. And he made that transition between early 1886 and the end of 1887, and he met everybody in artistic Paris, particularly the junior members. He was going to life classes with Toulouse-Lautrec. He met Gauguin certainly towards the end of his stay there, and visited Seurat's studio. He was suddenly absolutely up to date with everything which was happening in what was then definitely the international capital of the visual arts.
Well, Paris in the 1880s was, I mean, the greatest centre of concentration of renowned artists in history, arguably. He was, I would say, lucky, but he was in the right place in the sense that the artistic influences were all there for him, and there was this incredible new movement.
Vincent Van Gogh, of course, while he was in Paris, 1886, 87, was a very junior member of the club. He wasn't renowned at all. He had a few people who thought he wasn't bad. Possibly his work showed promise. But it's important to realize that at this point, and in fact, really, until he died, he was not a famous artist. There's an interesting, amusing memoir by a Scottish illustrator called Archibald Hartrick, who happened to be in Paris studying at exactly the same time as Van Gogh and knew Van Gogh, and actually quite liked him, though he thought he was half cracked, and he thought his work wasn't bad. So Van Gogh would come round to his flat he shared with another young English student and draw out ideas he had on pieces of paper on their kitchen table, and they'd always throw it away afterwards because it was just, one of Vincent's ideas. But Hartrick almost bought a painting by him, which he saw in a painting equipment shop window priced at 10 francs. And he really rather liked that painting, but he thought 10 francs, that's an awful lot for Van Gogh, which is a cautionary tale.
I bet his grandchildren must have really thanked him for that.
By the time he wrote this memoir, which was in the 1930s, he was already pretty rueful about that decision. But it gives you a sense of Van Gogh's status, or the lowness of his status at that stage.
Shall we now move south, as it were? Vincent left Paris and moved to Arles. I think it was 1888. Why did he do that? And tell us a bit about Arles.
Well, the question of why he went to Arles specifically is one of the great unsolved problems of art history. He wrote to Theo, I went south for 1,000 reasons, but he doesn't spell them out. I can name several. He was finding Paris was getting a bit much. He probably suffered from what we call seasonal affective disorder. So Paris is a relatively northern place, so a cold, dark northern winter made him depressed. He was drinking very heavily, he says in a letter. He was probably drinking heavily at most stages in his adult life, but it seems to have been at crisis level in Paris in 1887. There is a portrait of him by Toulouse-Lautrec with a glass of absinthe on the table in front of him, which probably was the way Toulouse-Lautrec thought of him. And he was very interested in the color and the general effects of light which you would get in a hot territory, a hot part of the world. He was obsessively interested in Japanese prints, and he had the idea that Japan was a hot country, which is why Japanese artists used these areas of flat color, bright color, and he thought that Provence, southern France, would be a bit like Japan. As to why he got off at Arles, it possibly was quite accidental. He stepped on, it was a stop on the express train from Paris to Marseille, and he stopped off because there was a bit of interest at that period in the folklore in Arles, and it was regarded as a place where artists might find interesting subjects and so forth. So he seems to have got off and just had a look around and got interested in it, decided to stay, and stayed on and on in the end for over a year.
And what sort of a place was Arles back then?
Well, according to Gauguin, it was the most lousy dump in the whole south of France, which he explored quite extensively. It was hot, dusty, mainly in terms of population, economic activity, distinguished by the fact it had a large barracks. So there were a lot of soldiers staying there, and a factory which was the maintenance department for the French railway company, which served the line from Paris to the south. Otherwise, old-fashioned town with, in the middle, some spectacular Roman remains, which I find it very interestingly, Van Gogh completely ignored. In the middle, there's a Colosseum-like Roman amphitheatre, which almost all other painters who went to Arles, just as a matter of course, painted. Vincent wasn't interested. His subjects are, for example, a bridge where the railway goes over a minor road, a municipal park in front of his house, bridge over the Rhone, extremely mundane, run-of-the-mill places. He was a very fast worker, and he worked extremely hard when in Arles. He was very productive throughout the later stages of his life, but after his first breakdown at Christmas 1888, he had recurrent relapses during which he'd be too ill to work for weeks or over a month in the case of the last one. So you're right that Arles was a highly productive. It was the most productive place where he worked. And again, the observation of David Hockney, who's very interested in Van Gogh, is that he wouldn't have got so far, so fast if he hadn't been isolated. This was something Hockney said, where he himself had deliberately isolated himself in Bridlington, which is not quite as cut off as 19th century Arles was, but maybe comparable in modern terms. And what Hockney meant by that was that it was an opportunity to think 100% of the time, really, about painting, which is probably what he did. But with the proviso that he was probably going dangerously fast. I mean, he was thinking fast. He writes in his letters that his mind was whirling with thoughts about how you balance these colors, how you work out the formula of this painting.
Well, can I ask you, it's very hard to diagnose historically, but is it considered that he had bipolar? Because he had these kind of moments of manic energy and then collapse after. Is that, do we know?
Well, when I wrote Yellow House, I went for bipolar, which is really because I talked through his case with a friend of mine who is a psychiatrist who was working in a mental hospital at the time, and I said, if you had a patient presenting these symptoms, what would you think? And she said, bipolar. Bipolar is quite a strong candidate. There is a medium-sized library on the subject of what might have been the matter with Vincent van Gogh, with a large number of different suggestions, including sunstroke and syphilis, and more or less you name it. I think whatever he had, it was evidently something he inherited, because two of his siblings seem to have suffered from something similar, and maybe his father as well.
Obviously, it was his madness, or whatever it was that afflicted him, which drove the last few years of his life. But before we get towards those disastrous final months, tell us about the domestic setup in the Yellow House and about his relationship with Gauguin.
Okay, the Yellow House was a humble earlier 19th century building which Vincent passed on his way out of town. In his first months in Arles, he was living in a hotel, and he walked out of town past the park, past this little house, under the railway bridge, and away into the fields and the orchards and so forth, the subjects he was painting. And it struck him, and after a while he decided to rent it, but he didn't actually move into this dwelling, which he called the Yellow House, until Gaugin turned up, which was towards the end of October 1888. Well, he moved in about in a month, 6 weeks before, to prepare the fixtures and fittings for Gauguin. He had gas put in, and he bought furniture and that sort of thing. So he was house building. And the result was a fascinating, unfortunately vanished example of, well, interior decoration by Van Gogh, and an attempt at a small, you could call it a micro artists colony. He got up to 2 artists. He in fact fantasized about having more artists, other people coming to work in the south. And when Gauguin arrived on the 23rd of October, he would have walked in and discovered that the whole house hung with Van Goghs, which would have been quite unlike the ones he'd seen the previous autumn. So he must have had quite a shock. And the 2 of them set about, this was part of Vincent's plan, a sort of menage. I've compared, I think, to the film The Odd Couple, in which Vincent, who was hopeless at cooking, cast Gauguin as the cook, and in fact Gauguin did produce a few meals for them. Gauguin seems to have been quite a respectable cook. Toulouse-Lautrec, by the way, was apparently an outstanding cook, so combination of cookery and art was quite possible in the late 19th century. Gauguin wasn't the only one. His Monet maintaining in Juvenet a very respectable table with a dedicated cook in the kitchen, and a recipe book with Cézanne sending in recipes from the south of France and so forth. So I think, in a way, the kind of tradition we associate with Elizabeth David's books in Britain, that possibly goes back to slightly bohemian cooking of the late 19th century. And so,
didn't Gauguin say that no mean woman could produce good cooking? He was a great believer in cooking as a sign of moral fibre in a woman in particular, because his mother-in-law was a great cook or something.
I think they might have eaten moderately well, actually, in the Yellow House, but they were 2 very difficult personalities, both highly strung, both neurotic, with slightly different views and tastes in art. So the combination was explosive and didn't last very long.
Can you describe the mature style of Van Gogh, which was emerging at this point, which those of us who aren't art experts or professionals feel we can spot, but aren't necessarily able to describe?
Well, Van Gogh is usually classified as a post-impressionist, which was a sort of desperate effort by Roger Fry to come up with a term to describe a set of artists who don't really have very much in common with each other, but who came after the Impressionists. And actually, the Impressionists don't have all that much in common with each other either. The common factors amongst the post-impressionists: strong, bright colour, often bright, always strong, I think. And in Van Gogh's case, that combined with absolutely brilliant draftsmanship and this impasto, a sort of language of brushstrokes, which I was saying earlier on, I would say goes back to the 17th century Northern European painting. And that combination actually is unique. And it's worth mentioning that I've said earlier on that Van Gogh coming out of nowhere and virtually untrained is an astonishing phenomenon. As a maker of as a draftsman, a drawer, he is, some would say, even better than he was as a painter. And Jenny Saville would say that, for example, has said that to me. But Hockney places Van Gogh in a very small category of great draftsmen, with Rembrandt, Picasso being the other 2 members of that tiny club. Lucien Freud I know, felt much the same. So he had this very, very strong ability to draw, which he found a way to express in paint, drawing in paint. That made him different from Gauguin. It made him different to actually all those other post-impressionists.
One always gets the impression that it was only his brother who really believed in him, and no one, and he still can sell paintings. But he was coming up in the estimation of the art world already, wasn't he? I mean, he wasn't. I've heard the theory that if he had lived a few more years, like 5 or 10 years, he would have actually had fame and fortune and a happy life. Maybe not a happy life.
Well, you're right, but yes, I think you're probably right on both accounts. I mean, he was a rough contemporary of two artists who I think are psychologically rather similar, or so similar in having psychological problems: Edvard Munch, Norwegian painter, and James Ensor, Belgian painter. They both had serious psychological breakdowns in early midlife, and possible suicide attempts survived them. And they both lived, well, Ensor died as a baron of the Belgian Empire during the Second World War. And Van Gogh, if he'd had a reasonably long life, could easily have been around in the 30s, by which time he was already virtually regarded as an old master.
But sadly, he didn't live that long, as we know. Why don't we talk about the final year or two, the final months, starting with the domestic crisis in the Yellow House, moving on to the asylum, of course, the story of the ear, and then eventually to his suicide. Tell us about that period, but also about the sort of art he continued producing even in these dark final days.
Yes. Well, I think one important point to make is that although he was certainly in a very odd psychological state at frequent intervals in his last 2 or 3 years, there are barely any works when you would say that that's evident. And in fact, my feeling is that it was the painting and drawing which were keeping him sane. And there's a Hockney theory that we all talk about what a miserable life he had, and to an extent he writes about that in his letters. But probably he was happy while he was painting, because if you're a natural painter, painting makes you happy. So a lot of the time he was content, perhaps, at his easel. But the level of work he'd done in Arles through the summer, where he describes his state then afterwards as maintaining a high yellow note. He was obviously working at dangerously high pressure, all on his own. And by September, he was getting into quite a state. He writes that in his letters to Theo. He woke up one day in early October feeling very odd, but then the idea of painting his bedroom came into mind, and he painted this room which to him suggested calm and peace, although it looks as if the perspectives rushing away in a rather alarming way to a lot of other people. And then when Gauguin arrived, the first thing he said was that Vincent seemed to be in quite a very worked up and a rather wobbly state. So he'd probably been on the edge for months. And then in December, it was getting worse. He and Gauguin had a day out, painter's day out by train to Montpellier to look at the art collection there, the art gallery. There's very fine works there. And Vincent wrote after, the atmosphere was electric. They couldn't agree about anything by that stage. And then just before Christmas, there was some sort of trigger, and a lot of debate about what the trigger was. Martin Bailey quite recently has suggested that what happened, which finally pushed Vincent over the edge, was he got a letter from his brother Theo with the, as far as Theo was concerned, happy news that Theo had become engaged to a young woman called Jo, or Jo in English, Joanne in English terms, and perhaps that would have excited and worried Vincent enough, because he might have seen his income disappearing, because Theo was funding everything, and if Theo started establishing a family, then there'd be other calls on his money, and so that might have been it. But he was obviously at a state where practically anything could have pushed him over the edge, I would say. Gauguin was obviously on the point of leaving. His announcement that he was going to go back to Brittany, that might have done it. They might have come together, and at that stage, Gauguin walked out. Gauguin spent the night in a hotel. Van Gogh at some point sliced off his ear. We now know it was virtually the whole ear with his razor, and took it off to a local brothel in a box where he handed it over. And so it said it ought to be handed to somebody who was on the staff, who was obviously in some way close to him. Went back home and collapsed. And when Gauguin went back slightly repentant the next day, he discovered that the whole house was covered in blood. Van Gogh was lying in bed, looking as if he might be dead. And the first move by the Arles police was to arrest Gauguin for suspected murder. And the position developed from there.
And thereafter, a descent into madness, asylums, and eventual suicide. Tell us the story.
It was a descent, but it wasn't a steady ascent, a descent rather. It was a descent which allowed him enough intervals of relative good mental health to create a large gallery of masterpieces over the next 18 months. He recovered quite rapidly, actually. This disaster with the ear happened in the night of the 22nd, 23rd of December. He was out of hospital by the end of the first week in January and started painting again. And, for example, Vincent with Bandaged Ear in the Courtauld Gallery in London, that was done within a few days of his leaving the hospital in Arles. He carried on for another few weeks, produced half a dozen important pictures, relapsed, went back to hospital, came out again, did more work, relapsed, and he carried on like that until finally he himself decided that he'd feel, on the whole, more settled if he were in some sort of institution. And he was sent to this hospital at Saint-Rémy, where he stayed for more or less for the next year.
And then eventually a return north, again some kind of recovery, and eventually, almost certainly, suicide.
His periods of ill health were getting longer and longer. He was ill for about 5 weeks in the spring of 1890. But then he came out of that bad period and felt completely well, or well enough, and came on the train to London, saw his brother, and for the first time his new sister-in-law, who describes him as looking strong and sunburnt and surprisingly healthy. I mean, possibly he'd been rather well looked after in hospital, but he apparently looked much better than Theo, who'd been working hard and also, although nobody knew it at that point, had syphilis and was actually dead within a year, much less than a year. Anyway, he came up to Paris. He found Paris a bit much, too much bustle, too many people, too much noise, and he was sent to live in Uve, a little village north in the countryside, north of Paris, which was a bit of an artist's colony. And he was under the supervision of a doctor called Gachet, who was an amateur painter and a friend of artists. And he was there for his last couple of months. And that in itself, he worked so furiously that those 2 months that constitute another Van Gogh period with a lot of important works in it. But eventually, it seems, I certainly believe, he shot himself. There is a certain amount of mystery about the event. Two of his biographers suggested that he might actually have been accidentally shot by some French schoolboys who were on holiday there as part of some sort of prank which went wrong. On the whole, it seems the most likely thing. If you have somebody who's seriously mentally ill, has threatened suicide, has committed acts of serious self-harm, and possibly a previous suicide attempt, then the simplest explanation is that he committed suicide. Although I'm bound to add that a reader of detective fiction would immediately say, what happened to the gun, which was never found? And that is an interesting loose end.
So then, after this, then his career really sort of starts in a way, in the sense that he achieved great fame after. I mean, it's interesting how his sister-in-law, so Theo dies 6 months later, and he's younger, but then Theo's widow Johanna becomes his great champion, and she creates the Van Gogh fan base.
In a way, we owe it all to Yo. It was put to me a long time ago, I think when I was writing The Yellow House, that an awful lot of young women, having married a husband, had a young child, whose husband almost immediately died, leaving them with not very much except for an apartment packed with the apparently unsaleable works of this said husband's extremely eccentric brother, and a desk packed with handwritten letters from this brother. Would have just chucked the whole lot in a skip and he would have started out on life again. But fortunately for posterity, Yo devoted the rest of her life to the promotion of Vincent's work, and actually the translation and publication of his letters as well. So a lot of the Van Gogh we know, we owe to her efforts.
Presumably she must have made a lot of money from it eventually.
After a bit, I mean, it probably took a while for prices to get very high. It's worth saying, by the way, that it's often said this thing about him having no success and virtually no sales. But actually, apart from the fact his career was extraordinarily brief, he was a bit of a break himself on sales. Whenever Theo in the letters suggests having maybe a little show or exhibiting some of his work in Paris, his reaction would be, "Oh no, I'm no good. That I'm not ready." That tremendous lack of self-confidence there. And he was appalled when somebody wrote a long article about him in February 1890, which is just a few months before he died. He wrote to the author, and what he wrote was, "I don't deserve this attention. There are others much more important than me who you should be writing about," and so on. So if Vincent had been around, it might have actually slowed his career.
I want to ask you about who he in turn has influenced, but then perhaps we could say that there's very little in 20th century art that has not in some way been influenced. Who do you think are the main heirs to the Van Gogh tradition?
It's quite hard to find a painter who doesn't name Van Gogh as one of their idols. That's not absolutely universal, but it's very, very common. I mentioned Hockney and Freud. Francis Bacon was a tremendous Van Gogh fan. Picasso revered him. Produced a self-portrait of himself in one of Van Gogh's straw hats at one point. But he apparently regarded Van Gogh as the most incorruptible of artists who wouldn't be swayed by the blandishments of success. According to John Richardson's, his test of that was, could he imagine a certain artist in a Rolls Royce? And with Van Gogh, the answer was no, he couldn't. Most other painters he could imagine in a Rolls Royce. Bacon did a whole series based on the Van Gogh's Road to Tarascon. Has done works based on Van Gogh's. More than the actual technical influence or influence in style, I think as an example of what an artist can be, he's very important. As somebody who just absolutely dedicates his life or her life to art, to a dangerous degree. I mean, it could be that something terrible was going to happen to Vincent, whatever happened, but he was completely consumed by his desire to make works of art.
Now, for those who've listened to your wonderful discussion of Van Gogh, thank you so much. Can you give some recommendations? We can certainly recommend your book on Van Gogh's time with Gauguin in Arles. Can you give some recommendations as to the best places to see Van Gogh? There's obviously a lot of it. The museum in Amsterdam comes to mind.
Well, first and foremost, the Van Gogh Museum. And actually, when we were talking about his heritage and how it was managed by his sister-in-law, actually, although the Van Gogh family, and Theo in particular, did sell quite a number of big, I mean, virtually all with a few exceptions, all the Van Goghs in the world were sold by the Van Gogh family. You know, a small number which he'd given to people and so forth, but otherwise they would all end up in Theo's hand. But she by no means sold everything, and the evidence for that is that her and Theo's son, who was born a few months before his uncle Vincent died, lived a very long life, and towards the end of it, he bequeathed everything to the Van Gogh Museum. He created the Van Gogh Museum, which possesses the residue of what was owned by the Van Gogh family, which is a huge number of works. So the Van Gogh Museum would be the very first place to go and see Van Gogh. The Kröller-Müller Museum in the central Netherlands, which was basis of which was a collection put together by a wealthy woman who was able to get a lot of the best works from the Van Gogh collection from Yale. After that, well, they're scattered around a bit, and although we don't have a lot in numerical terms, thanks to particularly to Samuel Courtauld, a very enlightened businessman and collector and patron, we've got some really star Van Goghs. And by walking between the National Gallery and the Courtauld Gallery along the Strand, you can see a selection of his absolutely greatest masterpieces, including the prime culmination of the Sunflower series. There are quite a few Sunflower paintings, but the most important in the National Gallery. And Vincent's Chair, also in the National Gallery. Vincent with Bandaged Deer, I mentioned in the Courtauld. So you could do pretty well in London. Otherwise, there's an exhibition. There's an exhibition this and I've written, actually, perhaps I should mention, I've written a short book for the National Gallery just about the sunflowers, which is going to come out in time for that exhibition.
Well, Martin, that's been fantastic. Thank you so much for your insight.